Hi, this is Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross, bringing you the Inclusive Minds podcast. This podcast was inspired by the book of which I'm a co-editor entitled Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. If you're a psychologist, a social worker, an addiction professional, or a healthcare provider, or anyone who wants to broaden your horizons, then this podcast is for you. The goal of the podcast is to help you understand some of the more complex issues facing our culture today. My guests are experts in their fields, and we'll be talking about a wide array of topics, including cross-cultural issues, the intersection of race and trauma, social justice, and health inequities. They will be sharing both their lived experiences and their expert opinions. The goal is to give you a felt experience and to let you know that you're not alone in being confused by these complex issues. We want to provide nuanced information with context that will enable you to make your own decisions about these important topics. Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross. Welcome to the Inclusive Minds podcast. Today, we have Dr. Shannon Z. Jones, and she wrote another chapter in our book, Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. Dr. Shannon Z. Jones earned her Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology from Winston-Salem State University and her PhD in Toxicology from UNC Chapel Hill. She continued her research at UNC Chapel Hill studying air pollution's effects on the immune system before joining the University of Richmond's biology department in 2015. Dr. Jones teaches courses on toxicology, interdisciplinary science, and environmental impacts on communities, and she mentors undergraduates in research on immunotoxicity. Her interests include the influence of environment and nutrition on immune function, as well as environmental justice and pollution in marginalized communities. Welcome to the show, Shannon.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, your chapter was amazing. I learned so much. And the title of the chapter is Environmental Racism in Rural America. So can you start us out by telling us what is environmental racism?
Absolutely. So I view environmental racism as a violation of basically of civil rights and basic human rights. And the philosophy behind environmental racism is that most often communities of color, and it's usually impoverished or low income communities, are more likely to be impacted by the burden of pollution wherever they live. And when I speak of a burden of pollution, I'm talking about industries that emit toxic chemicals into the air and the water. And study after study have shown that communities of color and low income communities are more likely to live in these areas that are heavily polluted. And it's not by accident. And it is a consequence of institutional racism.
Oh, wow. And that's despite the EPA and all of the other regulations we have in place.
Absolutely. And
And
some would
this
argue,
is
sorry.
still going on, right?
Absolutely. Yes. The earliest, I would say the event that inspired the movement happened in the 70s. One of the earliest cases happened in a middle income Black community in Texas, and that was really ignited the movement. And again, that was back in the 70s. So this
And
concept.
what was the pollution there?
So there was a community that was fighting the placement of a landfill just within a few feet of a school in their neighborhood. And what was interesting about that case is that they were a Black community that weren't impoverished, right? It was middle income community, and they were going to have this landfill called from Whispering Pines landfill placed in their community. And so there was a call to action. They actually sued. That was the first time a lawsuit had been filed citing racial discrimination when it comes to the environment. So that was sort of the key event that ignited this movement. And soon after, there was another case in my home state of North Carolina, in Warren County. They were a similar case. They were fighting the placement of a landfill that contained known cancer-causing agents being placed in Warren County. And so those two cases back to back really ignited a movement and a conversation about how communities of color, especially Black communities, are most often targeted by these polluting industries and placement of these
Wow.
industries.
So how did you first become interested in this subject in toxicology and all of that you're studying now?
Sort of my career is at stakes, and what I always tell my students and people who want to listen to my story is that where I ended up is very much a part of my is because of my lived experience and how and where and
Mhm.
how I grew up. And so I have been personally impacted by issues of environmental injustice or in environmental racism. And I grew up in rural North Carolina, where most of the income for the county that I'm from, Washington County, still today comes from a paper mill that operates in my county, and
Mm,
paper mills are notorious for spewing out very toxic chemicals into nearby bodies of water. And
mm.
so my first experience with this was having to do with where I grew up in this rural community with limited resources.
You said in the chapter that your family basically was living off the land,
Yes, yes,
had water coming from a well that
yeah.
you used for everything, bathing and drinking and cooking and so on. And did you find out that that water was polluted?
Absolutely. I always noticed growing up it had an awful smell. And I just thought that was how water smelled. Like I didn't know any difference in it. I learned later that it was because of the way our water was being secured from this well that it had this smell of rotten eggs, which I later learned was sulfur. And
Mm,
so I just remember our clothes when we washed them would always come out like brown or
mm,
yellow. So my mom had to we took our clothes to a laundromat a few miles away because we couldn't use our water at home. So we were careful about what we like using it to cook. That was my normal life experience
yeah.
growing up. And we later found and as I started going to school, I developed an interest in biology and like drawing connections between our environment and our health. And
Mhm.
so it really ignited a curiosity for me, especially when several members of my family were diagnosed with these chronic illnesses that we really couldn't explain where they were coming from. And so it's just like all the pieces started fitting together, and that our water contains toxic materials that could be impacting our health when many of my family members were diagnosed with chronic immune conditions.
Autoimmune condition.
Autoimmune,
Yeah.
yes,
And
yes.
so what were the pollutants that you found in the water of
So
the
well water is often contaminated with a chemical called trichloroethylene.
yeah.
Um, and so it would be years later when we actually did some testing. I was almost an adult when we actually found out what was in the water, but there are a lot of organic materials, so carbon containing like volatile chemicals. One of them is TCE. There are some metals in there.
Heavy metals,
Heavy
yeah.
metals were in there at low concentrations, but we know like low concentrations are enough to cause illness in humans. There's like a room.
Especially over time if you're drinking
Absolutely,
that water since birth.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, most of my family, we try not to use the water that comes out of tap, especially for cooking. We still use it for bathing, but for cooking, technology has advanced in some ways that we can filter it. So we have filters in place now, and then in some instances we rely on like bottled or gallon water, which also contributes to environmental issues because they're accumulating plastic now. So it's
Right. But
um
I had a similar situation that I didn't even think about as being part of this, but I used to live in Denver, and I
Mhm.
bought a home in the metro Denver area in a historically Black community. And it was, I loved my home and everything. And after we had been there for, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 years, the city came in and started going house to house, giving us Brita filter
Yeah.
containers that were specially designed to get rid of lead because they had these old pipes in the city. And the same thing happened when I bought another house for a rental property in another Black
Mhm.
part of the town. And then they came in and started digging up the pipes, but there was lead in the water in that part of Denver. Not
Wow.
everywhere in Denver, but yeah, in
Mm.
that part of Denver. So you mentioned how environmental racism impacted your own family, but in your chapter you talk about really interesting course that you teach at the university. It's at the University of Richmond, where you said the central question is, how is it that certain groups of people do not have access to basic natural resources or are systematically burdened with pollution or environmental hazards to a greater extent than other groups. So, how do you have students investigate that question?
Well, I tell them to start in their own backyard, look in their own community. And one of the first assignments I give them is to use a database basically that is run by the Environmental Protection Agency, where you can search by year, by state, by city. And what that report will give you is all of what are referred to as Superfund sites. And Superfund sites are designated as these areas across the United States are highly polluted with dangerous chemicals. And they're labeled as Superfund because the danger is deemed so high that the EPA has to invest government funds for cleanup. And
Wow.
students are
So
surprised.
that's the worst of the worst
That
area.
is the worst of the worst, and some unfortunately, some of them are ongoing, some of them have been resolved, but,
Mhm.
many of these cases are ongoing. Actually, turns out that the county that I grew up in has a Superfund site, and so that's what gave me the idea for this assignment is because sometimes students think that these issues are far removed from them, but they
Yeah.
find out that they're not, and so I think it's a very impactful experiment, say, to look in your own communities, look in your city, in your search by your zip code, and likely you may even find more than one.
Mm.
So I use that to engage them, ignite their interest and passion for
Yeah.
the topic because I think this is how we generate change agents, right?
How many of them end up finding Superfund sites near their homes?
Oh, I would say over half,
Wow.
over
That's
half.
a lot.
It is. And sometimes they even have international students where there's another database that we use. It's called the Environmental Justice Atlas that looks at global
Mm.
cases of environmental justice. And so
Mhm.
I've had students from South America, from some Asian countries, so in India. And so I give them the opportunity to also look, we expand it beyond the United States and they find cases as well. So it's a
And
global
how
issue.
do the students respond when they discover this?
It's interesting because it depends on their own understanding of the legacy of racism. So some of them, it's like, of course this happens, right? Like
Yeah.
they kind of expect it. And then others are shocked, especially when they ask, well, what's being done about it? And in some cases, we can't say it's resolved. And so there's some frustration of like or of the unfairness of it that there is no resolution. I think that's the hardest part for them to grapple with is that these cases are ongoing and sometimes there doesn't seem to be a resolution for the people that have been impacted. I think that's the hardest part. Like how do we remain having positive feelings and feeling hopeful when there's so many of these cases that have not yet been resolved?
And when you think about the Superfund site near where you live, I'm sure many of the students still have family members living in
Yes.
those areas. So there's that, I'm
Yes.
sure, the worry that,
Yes.
what do we do? So when you found out about the Superfund site near your family home, what can you do about it?
I was mostly shocked because it had happened so many years ago and I never heard about it. None of my family members knew about it.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and this case happened about almost 50 years ago. And
Hmm.
so it had been resolved, but just the fact that it got resolved maybe in the late 90s, which is when I was growing up. But the fact that it had existed for so long, and there's also a conflict of feelings there because the source of the pollution generated income for my family, right?
And
So
was that the paper mill?
yeah,
Was
that's the paper mill.
okay, yeah.
And
And
so
you said your uncle, when
all
you
of
said,
my
"What's
uncles,
that smell?" Your uncle
yes,
said, "It's the
that's the
smell of
smell of
money."
exactly. And a lot of people in the town still think to this day that they rely on this for income and it's just a part of life. That paper mill still exists. And so I like to think, okay, that particular issue was resolved, but the mill is still there, still emitting
Yeah,
air pollution. So how much of it is really resolved, right?
yeah.
They've tried to mitigate their release of toxicants into the water, but there's still the air pollution there. And so
Mhm.
I say it's resolved, but
But
it's
it's
not.
never gonna be
No,
completely resolved.
no.
So, you also said that you learned a lot from the exercise that you gave your students. What was that like for you?
So finding out about my own family's experience, it made me want to amplify the voices of the people that have been impacted. And so by teaching this class and working with the students, it feels like my mission now is to advocate for people who have been impacted, not just people from my hometown, but people all over the US and in
Mhm.
other countries. And so what I've learned about it is the power of our voices.
Oh, wow. That's
And it may feel like one person can't make a difference, but if we continue to tell our stories
mm,
collectively, we can. And I think that's the biggest lesson. I mean, it makes me sad, but it's not enough to stop the work that I'm doing. It's actually doing the opposite. It's energizing me to, again, to tell the stories of the people who are impacted, which is the impetus for my course. We travel to different EJ communities across the US.
oh, for example, like,
So we have gone to Cancer Alley in Louisiana. I've taken students to Cancer Alley in Louisiana.
what's the source of the pollution there?
It's all the oil refineries. So it turns out that between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, there's about 85 miles along the Mississippi River where there are over 100 oil refineries and
Mhm,
petrochemical companies. And
mhm.
because they're along the river, all the waste that those oil refineries release, it gets into the water. And
Wow.
most of the people that live in that area are, again, mostly people of color, Black
Yeah.
families, middle to low income families. And it was a morbid nickname they received called Cancer Alley because at one point in time, that particular region had almost 10 times the cancer incidence than the rest of the country.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's one thing to read about it, but it's another thing to see it firsthand. And
Mm.
so that's what I wanted my students to take away from it. And that's what I continue to take away from it is we're not just reading about these abstract concepts. These are real people impacted by pollution.
So what are some of the other sites you've traveled to with your students?
The other place we've gone to recently, so I've taught this class 4 times. So the first 3 we went to different parts of Louisiana, and then this most recently we traveled to Puerto Rico. Yes, and so that was last year, and the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico is of great
A
interest,
whole 'nother
right? It's a
story.
whole 'nother. But I like to say that that's one of the reasons why Puerto Rico has so many issues. So we talk about climate justice, right? Lack of access to healthcare and how that can interplay with environmental pollutants there. So they have a coal ash problem. They have a landfill like trash problem. So we try to dissect all of the issues and at the root of it is racial discrimination and the othering of people that are supposed to be US citizens. So there was so much to unpack with that.
Yeah. So
Uh,
the coal ash is that a plant? A
yes,
coal plant?
yes. So they still rely heavily on coal there. So it's from
Okay.
coal plants. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And what kind of health issues are showing up from that?
I forgot one other issue is Vieques. So Vieques is a small island off the coast of mainland Puerto Rico, and the US had military practices there, and they left behind a lot of ammunitions and heavy metals. So they didn't clean up their mess. The US Navy left a ton of ammunitions behind on that island. And so even compared to mainland Puerto Rico, residents of Vieques have higher incidence of cancer, like a lot of breast cancer, diabetes, poor maternal health outcomes, but really what we focus on was the higher incidence in cancer directly caused by heavy metals left behind from those ammunitions,
Mm.
when the US Navy occupied that island of Vieques.
Yeah. And has anything been done about it, or is it still?
Still.
Because you said it was just you went a year ago,
Right, and it
basically, and nothing has changed, yeah.
no.
Puerto
Uh,
Rico is an orphan state,
yes,
basically.
right, right, and they're not receiving the aid they should
Mhm.
as US citizens. Uh,
Right.
so again,
Not
lots
to
of unpack.
mention the hurricanes
Yes,
aid that they were meant to have and
right,
so on, so
right.
it's hard to think about, yeah.
Yeah. The difficulty students have is again grappling with these very heavy topics and how to again remain hopeful and yeah, that's a hard thing to and I grapple with that as an instructor, like how much of this do I show them, but this is the real world, right? These issues
But
exist.
I think when you show them, they'll never forget it.
Right.
You talk about it in
Right.
class, it'll be there
Yes.
for,
Right.
maybe a
Right.
week or a
Yes.
month, but when you take them somewhere, that is very powerful, that's exciting to hear about, yeah.
Mhm.
So in your chapter, you also talk about for the first time in US history, the federal government led by the Biden administration has set a goal that promises that 40% of the overall benefits of
Mhm.
any federal investment will be received by communities affected by the pollution. So, how's that going?
Not great right now. I remember the day that I showed this website to my students last year. It's called Justice 40 Initiative. And I said this is the first time environmental justice has been featured on the White House webpage. Like we looked at the webpage. And very soon after this new administration took over, that webpage is gone.
Yeah, as
It's
are most other web pages
yes.
having anything
So
to do with, Black
just
and brown
right,
people.
right. To me, that was just very symbolic of erasure,
Yeah,
and that
true.
these efforts that and these commitments that have been made no longer exist.
Yeah.
We were having for several years open dialogue about environmental justice. Michael Reagan, like the former director of EPA appointed by Biden, right? He visited EJ communities. He went to Warren County where the first EJ case or environmental racism case was fought. And it
Mhm.
felt like we were taking a turn for the better, and now it just
Mhm.
seems like all that work has been erased, unfortunately. So the Justice 40 initiative, to my
It's
knowledge, is gone.
Yeah, yeah. Now, there was the movie Erin Brockovich.
Yes.
What year, approximately did that happen? And is that another example
That
of
is.
environmental racism? And maybe not racism, but having to do with, communities living in
Yes.
poverty? Yeah.
Yes, and I can't remember the year, but I do talk about this case with my class. It happened in Hinckley, California. So
Mhm.
not exactly a case of environmental racism, but definitely environmental injustice, where the
Right.
community that was impacted was low and middle income community, and it was by the PG&E Electric Company. And so it was told very well in the movie, but I've since then done some research on the case. And again, I can't recall the exact year, but
Yeah.
there's a very well-known case of environmental injustice,
Mhm.
and the fact that there was just inaction to fix it, right? It took this.
Are there any current or recent environmental injustice cases that have been in the news?
Of course, there's Flint, Michigan.
Oh, yes. Okay, yeah.
That one's it's hard to believe now that's been over 10 years ago, but to me,
Hard to believe,
hard
yeah.
to believe. So there's Flint, Michigan. There was a water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, still
Yep.
ongoing. They're always led problems, unfortunately. You find these cases in like heavily populated urban areas. So
Mhm,
Washington, D.C. has had a lead crisis. Where I live currently, Richmond, Virginia has had a lead crisis.
mhm.
Cities in New York. So until all those lead pipes get replaced, fortunately, these cases are going to make the news. And so I always tell students that I'll be teaching this class as long as I can because this issue is going to exist for likely the rest of my lifetime, and I'm not gonna stop
Mhm.
sharing these stories, my story, other people's stories.
Do you have any worries for yourself and your own health?
I do. I mean, and the environmental impact on our health is a complicated topic, right? It's not just our environment, it's also our genetics, right? So I think about my family history of diseases, and so it is a combination. I
But
know.
it's also intergenerational
Yes, exactly.
changes that have been maybe fostered by these toxins.
Absolutely.
The change in expression of DNA, it can then be passed on to you
Yes.
and to your children.
So I do have concerns, especially as a toxicologist, right? I know how
Yeah.
dangerous these chemicals are. And it's a little ironic, going to the doctor to check on my health, knowing that I've had these exposures. And so I try to mitigate that as best as possible. So I try to live a healthy lifestyle, but there's always in the back of my mind about these early life exposures that I've had and that my family had. And so it is a part of is what I think about regularly, I would say.
Are there measures that one can take? I mean, I know in Scandinavian countries that they believe heavily in saunas, for example, as a way to detox. Are there any studies that show how you can get rid of these toxins or even how you can measure whether they've affected you?
Yes, so there is a such thing as a biomarker. This field is becoming more, I guess, well studied. Is what are the traces left behind after we're exposed to these toxic chemicals? What are some things in our blood that we can measure to see if we've been exposed? And it turns out almost everybody, and it's hard to avoid exposures. But what also I conduct research with students, and I'm interested in nutrition and how our diet impacts how we respond to these chemicals. And it
Yeah.
turns out, so there's not necessarily like a detoxification pathway, but our diet does play a big role in our immune health. So it turns out there are lots of plant products that have these natural antioxidant properties that
Yeah.
can block the effects of
And that are natural detoxifiers like the
yes.
cruciferous
Yes,
vegetable.
exactly. So that's what I
Yeah.
study. I study the effects of air pollution on the immune system, and we look for products that have natural anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties, and those include cruciferous vegetables.
Like
So
broccoli and
yes,
cabbage and
yes,
oh,
yes. So
yeah.
I'm a big fan of promoting nutrition, and that was one of the things that came out of the Flint crisis is where they found that Flint is a food desert. And
Uh,
so the kids that were impacted were even more severely impacted because they had malnutrition, right?
yeah.
So the doctors actually were prescribing fresh fruits and vegetables to help block the effects of the lead. So our health, like all these issues intersects, right? So not only do they have a lead problem, they have a access problem to fresh fruit and vegetables. So that to me is a perfect example of how multiple factors intersect to impact our quality of life. And so
And our longevity too.
exactly, exactly.
So if someone is listening and they want to check for themselves, where can they go to find out if there's a Superfund site near them?
So as long as it exists, the EPA website is a
Oh,
good place to
gosh.
start. As long as we have the EPA, I don't know how much scrubbing has happened, but that's a good place. That's how I actually found out
The
about
Environmental Protection Agency
environmental
keeps a
protection.
site, and on their site, they'll say,
There's yes, you can search your zip code or your city, and
okay,
it'll give you the most recently identified
yeah,
super.
that's probably worth doing. I
Yes,
don't know that many of us could move if we are
right,
near a site, but maybe we could eat more broccoli, that's
right,
for sure. Or exercise or get a small
right,
sauna in our
right.
backyard, whatever.
And I would
Okay.
say, the local health department also has information about exposure when it comes to like lead, heavy metal exposures. That's another place to start. But the website for the EPA is called the Toxic Release Inventory.
Toxic release inventory, okay. And what if they find, yeah, there is a Superfund site near me, what can I do? If I can't move, what can I do? What are some options that you
I
tell
would
people?
I would say mobilize. That's the first thing that people can do to know that they're not alone, right? So, town meetings, a place for folks to gather, to come together, to see what that they're all impacted. And the
Mm.
best thing to do is go to your local officials, city officials, government officials to
So
make
you mean your elected
yes,
officials?
yes, yes, elected officials are the best place to start, and to voice your concerns. You can also request it's called a Freedom of Information Act, right?
Mm,
That you have the right to request this information about what exposures you've had, and so even local EPA offices, they are required to give that information to us if it's requested, right? So, I would
okay.
say mobilize, these grassroots efforts can have amazing impact, and I've seen that firsthand in EJ community.
Have you seen any of your students using AI resources in order to either learn more about this or create activism around
Yeah,
this?
I encourage them to. A lot of people in higher education are a little afraid of AI right now, but I tell
Mhm.
them to use it as a tool, right? Like
Yeah.
just like we use any other website. Like you can and there's a particular site called EJ Atlas, and the EJ stands for Environmental Justice Atlas. And it gives you a global scope of environmental justice issues. And so one of the final assignments I have my students do is to make a public service announcement about a particular case. So again, it's amplifying people's voices so they can create a podcast, they can create social media presence, they can create a video. And so a lot of times they do take advantage of AI tools to generate these projects, which are turn out amazing.
I
Um,
have to say your course sounds incredible. I wanna take it.
It's one of the things I'm most proud of I've done lately. It makes me feel like I'm using science for good, right? Like I'm
Yeah,
trying to create new change agents, right, for the future. So it's one of the
mm,
things I'm most proud of.
yeah, and we have to keep fighting
Yeah.
a good fight. So, I like to ask my guests, do you have hope for the future given all that we're dealing with right now?
I do, because if we don't have hope, what else is there? I like what and I have hope that my students are active. I can't they think about things in a way that I wasn't thinking about when I was 20, 19, 20. So
Wow.
they give me hope. They're like and they get out and they act, right? Like they're
Mm.
not afraid to raise their voice. So they give me hope. They're energetic. They care about these topics. They care about each other. They care about the world. So that's where my hope is coming from. It's
Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it's been great to talk to you, Dr. Shannon Z. Jones, and we look forward to hearing more from you and your students.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit of my story.
You're very welcome. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Inclusive Minds podcast so we can let you know when the next great guest comes on. The link to subscribe is in the caption below.